Okay, this is part 2 of our overview of Chapter 6 in the textbook, DQM. So we'll continue our discussion of interviewing, and we left off with the idea that you could interview focus groups. And on 132, your authors talk about the idea of internet-based interviewing. You don't need to know a lot about this, you just need to know that it's possible. You're going to actually do one kind of internet interviewing. Quite likely you'll have a choice of interviewing somebody who lives with you or interviewing somebody over Zoom, depending upon what question our group class as a whole chooses, and I'll talk more about that later for now. But anyway, the point is that right now the people are doing interviews in a mediated fashion. They're doing email interviews where they ask a set of questions and then follow up by asking more questions. People do interviews in chat rooms or over instant messaging. They do interviews over all kinds of social media, like posting back and forth on Facebook, on a private, or Facebook Messenger, that kind of private thing. And then they also, of course, use Skype or Zoom, those kinds of software, so that you can do interviewing in those fashions. Um, the form of sampling that we do for interview research, which is on 133, is theoretic sampling. And this is the idea that we can't do a random sample, right? And the reason that we can't, though, is because we're not looking at something super general. Usually with an interview study, you're trying to find people who'd had a particular type of experience. So you're trying to interview athletes, for example, about how they feel about communicating with their coaches, or you're trying to interview people who've survived sexual assault, or you're trying to interview people who have done an internship in preparation for what they hope will be their future career. You're trying to find people who've done study abroad, or in my case, I usually want to talk to healthcare providers, or I've done a study of long-term cancer survivors, of which I am one, and I have talked to other long-term cancer survivors about the ways in which, after surviving cancer, the chemo or surgery or radiation or whatever other kinds of treatments that they had when they had cancer cause these things called late effects, meaning things that happen to you in the years afterward that are caused by those treatments, or basically side effects or long-term effects of those treatments. And I did an interview study of those people. So the point is, you have to find people who can actually answer the question. So it's never random. Getting a random sampling of people does not allow you to make sure that the people have had the kind of experience or are the kind of people. For example, maybe you only want to interview men about something, or you only want to interview gender non-binary, non-conforming, and gender fluid people about something, or maybe you only want to talk to women who are between the ages of 18 and 25, right? So the point is that you do theoretic sampling, and it doesn't mean theoretical. The term is a little bit confusing that way, but what it means is you find people who fit the issue or the problem or the question that you are trying to answer. How many people is something that comes up a lot, and this is on 134. The number and type of people that you have can be anywhere from about 10 to 100 people, and even more, especially when the interviews aren't particularly long. When interviews are often an hour or more, it's often common to have 10 to 20 interviews, but again, people often do more. Because we don't use numbers and statistical tests in qualitative research, we have a concept called saturation. Right? If you think of it, and that means when you're starting to hear the same kinds of things, when you feel like you're full up with explanations and understandings, such that you're hearing a lot of the same things. When you do new interviews, of course, there's always some unique details, but you're hearing a lot of the same things, topics, and experiences be described. That's called saturation, and it's a metaphor. If you think about a sponge or a piece of cloth being saturated, that means it holds as much liquid as it's able to, so that when you squeeze it, lots of water comes out, or at least as much water as it's capable of holding. It's all full up of water, right? So saturation means you're saturated with information, and that's when you stop doing interviews and move on to the formal stages of qualitative data analysis. Okay, on page 135, they introduce the idea of a good match, or the idea of matching. We're going to talk a lot more about this when you read a great piece called when gender isn't enough, which is a classic piece about what we would now call the intersectionality of identity. But at the time, she was talking about the ways in which we feminist researchers have sometimes made the mistake of paying attention to gender, which didn't used to be paid adequate attention to. So we need to do that, but without realizing that other differences would also affect how people understand each other. We'll talk more about that later. But anyway, finding a good match. The main thing to take away for now is that yes, sometimes women interviewing women, or queer people interviewing other queer people, people of color interviewing people of color, young Latinas interviewing other young Latinas, that can be really good because they match in certain key identities, and therefore they are likely to understand each other. But there are also disadvantages. It's not necessarily bad when you're interviewed by somebody quite different from you. In fact, sometimes you give much more thorough explanations to people when you think they're not likely to have shared experiences. So a person who is queer or non-binary might give a much more thorough example of what that means to someone who is cisgendered and heterosexual, but is very open-minded and seems kind and compassionate, right? One of the things I talk about is that, I'm a middle-aged woman now, but when I started doing research, I was still a fairly young woman, and I was young enough to be the grandchild of a lot of the research participants I had at the cancer clinic that I studied when I was doing my PhD research. And so the people often thought of me as being like their grandchild, and therefore were happy to explain lots and lots of things to me. And they knew I was a cancer survivor, right? And they were there because they had cancer. So me being like their grandchild, but very different from them in some ways, right? And me being sharing in a common denominator with them of being a cancer survivor was important. They would be very open with me in a lot of ways. So it's not necessarily good or bad to have people who are matched by important characteristics like gender or race or age group. It's not necessarily better. It just gets you very different data. Okay, on 136, they discuss the idea of how do you find your participants, and there's lots of different ways that's happening. Sometimes you go to a university or to the athletic department. You might ask if you can approach members of SCAP or members of a sorority or fraternity, but at the beginning of a meeting. I have gone to support groups for patients and asked if I could talk. There's various online listservs and bulletin boards that you can say, or Facebook now, and Instagram, and you can say, hey, I'm a researcher and I'm looking for people who have these kinds of characteristics. There's lots of different ways that we can do it. We often also use our own networks. Um, and this is called snowball sampling. If you think it's like if you have a little ball of snow that you've made, right? Then it starts rolling down a hill. It picks up more and more snow. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger by the time it gets to the bottom. So it's a metaphor, meaning that you start out with a few contacts that you have and spread out from there. Hopefully, you will get more people. And I have to, on 137, they talk about the idea that sometimes this leads to us interviewing people that we already know, and we all think we'll be more comfortable that way. And that is understandable. And since you're brand new at this and undergrads, of course, I'm going to have you interview somebody that you already know. However, I do want to tell you that there are real disadvantages to that, particularly if you interview your best friend or your main squeeze, whoever it is you're consensually squeezing, whatever gender that person might be or identity that person might have. When you interview somebody that you know that well, they often don't do a very good job. They just assume you already know that answer, or they know that you were there and had shared that experience with them. So they can be reluctant to give you a lot of details and sometimes seem like the perfect person until you start interviewing them, and then they won't elaborate or give you data. And you can't use it in a study if they don't say it out loud. You can't say, well, I was there and I remember what happened. You can actually, if you do autoethnographic research. Remember, that's at the far artsy end of the continuum, and that is not what we're talking about here. So you can pick someone you know, but they're make sure you pick like the chattiest person you know and the most willing. Maybe buy them a beverage of whatever type, or since you're now isolated, promise to buy them a beverage the next time you see them. Okay. On 138, preparing for the first interview, they're talking a lot about location of interviews. This should be a quiet place. It should be a free from distractions. It should be someplace where that person feels comfortable. As a person who interviews routinely people I don't know, I interview people, I offer them a range. Would you like to come to my office? Would you like me to meet you in a public place? Would you like me to come to your home? I don't actually, for safety reasons, invite people to my own home, but I try to do what makes them feel comfortable. The problem with this is that for people who you don't know who might want to meet you in public, that can be tricky because you also need a place that's quiet and free of distractions where the person will feel comfortable telling you what may be very private information, and that can be really difficult to do. They don't recommend that you do it in coffee shops, even though it's understandable. There's a list of characteristics in the box 6.5. There's no such thing as a neutral place, right? So you want to think carefully about where you're doing it. Where you're conducting the interview. There's power and authority on both sides, but there can also be really special needs. And as a researcher, especially a feminist researcher, you don't want to abuse that power that you have over the other person. You want to use that to enact an ethic of care and err on the side of being caring to them. On 139, they talk about the idea that you need to address appropriately to the situation, not just dress up. This is exactly the same thing as with ethnography, right? So you shouldn't overdress. If you're talking to another student, you should wear whatever it is you normally wear as a student. Okay, on page 140, they elaborate on the idea that you want to be prepared by testing your equipment out and your battery, making sure that if you're recording this on your phone or your laptop, that your battery is charged, right? Just basic stuff, but you can get in trouble if you aren't good, don't do a good job with that. Lastly, on page 142 in this chapter, they talk about the idea that you want to make sure that the person is clear on two things. The purpose of the interview, right? This is part of informed consent. They have a right to know what topic you are, and if you tell them ahead of time, they have a chance to start to think about that topic and be ready to talk to you. The other thing they need to know about is that this is completely voluntary and they are free to stop at any time, and that they won't get in trouble. There's no bad consequences. You're not going to get angry with them. It's really important that people never feel coerced to continue an interview that they don't want to continue, particularly for feminist interviewing.